You have been deceived. From the very first history lesson in school, you were fed a lie, the scale of which is simply impossible for an ordinary person to comprehend. We are told that the 19th century was the era of steam, coal, and humanity's first clumsy attempts to build an industrial society. We are shown pictures where grimy workers with picks and shovels create masterpieces that, even today, with our lasers, cranes, and computer modeling, are extremely difficult to replicate. Have you ever wondered where so much metal came from in those times when, according to the official version, the primary mode of transport was a horse-drawn cart? Look closely at photographs from the late 19th century. What do you see? Grandiose bridges, gigantic railway stations with intricate vaulted ceilings, framed buildings, and of course, the pinnacles of this technological absurdity, the Crystal Palace in London and the Eiffel Tower in Paris. Historians nonchalantly assert that all of this was designed on paper by candlelight, then cast and assembled by hand by semi-literate workers in record time. But the moment you pick up a calculator and a metallurgy handbook, the official version begins to fray at the seams, revealing a frightening emptiness. Let's begin our investigation with an object dubbed a marvel of the Victorian era, the Crystal Palace in London, purportedly built in 1851. We are told that this gigantic structure of glass and cast iron was erected in just a few months. Just consider these figures. The exhibition pavilion's area exceeded 90,000 square meters. The building's length was 564 meters, and its height was 33 meters. And all of this, according to textbooks, was built by a gardener, Joseph Paxton. A gardener! A man who had previously built greenhouses suddenly designs a building that requires engineering calculations on par with modern strength of materials. But the most alarming aspect lies not in the architect's identity, but in the materials. Its construction required 4,500 tons of cast iron and iron structures, and that's just the framework. Add to that 300,000 sheets of handmade glass. Official history asserts that all the necessary parts were manufactured at various factories across Britain, brought to Hyde Park, and assembled like a construction set. It sounds smooth until we start to calculate. 4,500 tons of metal. In the mid-19th century, metallurgy, as we are told, was just finding its feet. To obtain such a quantity of pure, high-quality cast iron for load-bearing structures, tens of thousands of tons of ore would need to be processed and mountains of coal burned. Where are these quarries? Where are these gigantic smelting furnaces capable of producing goods of such quality and at such a pace? If you look at the statistics for cast iron production of that time, you will see that the entire industry of Britain would have had to work exclusively on this palace, halting the production of rails, machinery, and weapons. But let's assume they cast it. How did they deliver it? Railways in 1850 had a ridiculously low capacity. The primary freight transport was horse-drawn carts. Imagine the logistics. Thousands of carts, loaded with multi-ton beams, crawling along the muddy roads of England towards the centre of London. This should have been a logistical collapse that would have paralyzed the capital for a year, but in the newspapers of that time, silence. No mention of a transportation hell. The palace simply grew, like a mushroom after rain. And here we come to the main question, the quality of the casting. Look at old photographs or engravings of the Crystal Palace interiors. These are not just crude beams. These are elegant, artistic castings, standardized parts that fit together perfectly. Nowadays, to achieve such precision in mass production, computer numerical control, CNC machines are used. And we are told that in the 19th century, when standardization was in its infancy, thousands of different workers in different factories made parts that fit together millimeter by millimeter during assembly. This is technologically impossible for the level of development attributed to them. Either they possessed technologies we are not told about, or the Crystal Palace is a legacy of another civilization that was simply unearthed, restored, and presented as their own achievement. Remember what happened to this palace. It burned down. It burned to the ground in 1936. A building of iron and glass burned down like a matchbox. Cast iron does not burn. Glass melts at extremely high temperatures. To destroy such a behemoth, a temperature comparable to an industrial furnace is needed. Or was it a deliberate demolition to hide traces of technologies we were not meant to see? And now let's transport ourselves to France, to 1889, the Eiffel Tower, a symbol of Paris or a monument to our blindness? We are told that Gustave Eiffel built it in 2 years, 2 months, and 5 days. The weight of the metal structure is 7,300 tons. The total weight is over 10,000 tons. 7,000 tons of wrought iron. Do you know what wrought iron is? It's metal obtained by manually stirring molten pig iron in a furnace to burn off carbon. Manually. Imagine this hellish labor. To obtain 7,000 tons of high-quality iron by the puddling method, armies of workers would be needed, stirring molten metal day and night with iron bars. This is back-breaking, inefficient labor. With such a method, it is impossible to achieve material uniformity. Each batch of metal would differ in chemical composition and strength. Yet the Eiffel Tower stands. It is assembled from 18,038 metal parts, fastened with 2.5 million rivets. 2.5 million rivets. Do you understand what that means? Each rivet must be heated red hot, inserted into a hole, and hammered into place before it cools. This must be done at height, in the wind, with jeweler's precision. If the holes don't align by even a millimeter, the structure won't assemble. Official history states that the holes were drilled in advance at the factory. That is, Eiffel's engineers calculated all 18,000 parts with an accuracy down to tenths of a millimeter and never made a single mistake. Without computers, without laser rangefinders, using slide rules and paper blueprints, this is statistically impossible. With such a volume of manual labor and primitive production methods, the percentage of defects should have been colossal. The tower should have been crooked, askew, requiring constant on-site adjustment. But it is perfect. It is so aerodynamically and load-distributionally perfect that even modern engineers are amazed by its stability. Where did this metal come from? In the late 19th century, France was not experiencing its best times, the consequences of wars, economic crises, and suddenly the state spends an insane amount of a strategic resource, high-quality iron, on what is essentially a useless tower for an exhibition. Where is the logic? Where is the economic justification? We are told it's a demonstration of power, but it looks more like the utilization of a ready-made resource obtained for free. There is a theory that Eiffel did not build the tower from scratch. He might have been involved in its reconstruction or assembly from pre-existing elements found in the warehouses of some preceding, more advanced era. Or perhaps the tower itself is the framework of an ancient technical device from which the casing and internal equipment were removed, leaving only the skeleton that was presented as an architectural masterpiece. Look at photographs of the tower's construction. They are strange. In them, we see already finished gigantic blocks being lifted by unknown cranes. We see a small number of workers. Where are the crowds of people? Where are the mountains of shavings, debris, rejected parts? The construction site looks sterile. It resembles the assembly of stage sets more than heavy construction. We are facing a technological impasse. On one hand, there are the official figures and dates drilled into our heads. On the other hand, the laws of physics, chemistry, and logistics scream that producing, delivering, and assembling such volumes of metal in the 19th century, using the stated technologies, was impossible. Someone is playing a shell game with us, substituting real history with a pretty fairy tale about technological progress. But if they couldn't build it, then who did? And most importantly, when? The answers to these questions will overturn your perception of reality. Let's delve into the numbers that bring down the house of cards of official history and look at the demographic situation of that time. This is a key point that historians carefully avoid or bury under mountains of meaningless statistics. We are told about the Industrial Revolution, about the explosive growth of cities, about crowds of workers storming factory gates. But mathematics is a stubborn and cruel thing. To produce thousands of tons of metal, it's not enough to simply build a furnace. A colossal infrastructure is needed, and most importantly, skilled people. Look at the real data on the population of Europe and America in the mid-19th century. We see strange dips and inconsistencies. Cities in photographs from that era appear eerily deserted. The grand avenues of St. Petersburg, Paris, Washington, lined with majestic buildings, are absolutely devoid of people. Where are all these millions of inhabitants? Where are those very workers who supposedly erected these cyclopean structures? We are told this is due to the long exposure times of old cameras, implying that moving objects simply weren't captured. But this is a weak excuse. With an exposure of several minutes, shadows should have remained, streets should have been blurred by streams of movement, but we see clean, dead cobblestones. There is a well-founded theory that the 19th century was a time of recovery after a global catastrophe, the very cataclysm that alternative researchers call the mud flood or the Great Reset. Humanity was thrown back. There was a catastrophic shortage of adult, trained population. Remember the phenomenon of the so-called orphan trains in the United States, and the strange fashion for child chimney sweeps and child miners in Europe. Where did millions of street children come from? Where did their parents go? And in this world, where there is a shortage of adult men, where logistical chains are destroyed, where survivors are trying to establish a life amidst the ruins, we are told about the construction of the Crystal Palace and the Eiffel Tower. Who stood at the blast furnaces? Children? Or a handful of surviving masters who miraculously preserved the secrets of metallurgy? To produce such a volume of steel and cast iron, thousands of experienced metallurgists, engineers, and chemists are needed. They need to be trained for decades. In the post-apocalyptic conditions of the 19th century, they simply couldn't be found. Now let's talk about energy. This is the foundation without which any metallurgy is simply fantasy. To smelt 1 ton of cast iron using the technologies of that time, several tons of charcoal or coke were required. Multiply that by tens of thousands of tons of metal needed for the construction of bridges, railway stations, those same palaces and towers. This means that Europe should have been bald. Forests should have been clear-cut. Coal mines should have been working at their physical limits, bringing millions of tons of fuel to the surface. But we look at maps and forestry reports. The forests are intact. Coal extraction volumes are growing, but they absolutely do not correspond to the appetites that would have been required for the declared construction boom. The energy balance doesn't add up. Where did they get the energy for smelting? The official version is silent or mumbles something about the efficiency of new furnaces. But the laws of thermodynamics cannot be cheated. Either 100 times more coal was mined, and we don't know where, or the metal was not smelted with coal. There is a frightening possibility that this entire metallurgical industry of the 19th century is a fiction, a facade. The massive factories shown in engravings could have simply been places for remelting, or even more likely, warehouses for finished products of a previous civilization. Imagine finding a giant warehouse with I-beams, pipes, and cladding sheets left behind by those who lived here before us. You don't need to mine ore. You don't need to burn forests. You simply take what's ready, adapt it slightly to your needs, and present it as your own invention. This explains why the quality of metal in old structures often surpasses modern equivalents. This explains the absence of slag heaps, which should have been mountain-sized if production had started from scratch. We live on the ruins of giants, using their spoons and forks, and proudly call it industrialization. The technological leap of the 19th century was too sharp, too unnatural. In 50 years, humanity supposedly jumped from oil lamps to electricity and skyscrapers. In biology and sociology, such leaps are impossible without external intervention or the use of an already existing base. We look at the intricate lattices of old bridges, at complex riveted structures, and fail to grasp the main point. This is not just iron. These are elements of a single global system whose purpose we have forgotten. The Crystal Palace and the Eiffel Tower are not exhibition pavilions. Their form, their structure, their materials hint at a purely technical, functional purpose. Perhaps these were stations for transmitting energy, atmospheric electricity, about which researchers of Tartaria speak so much. And the metal for them was not cast by gardeners and bridge builders. It was taken from reserves that miraculously survived the catastrophe. Now let's come down to earth and look at details that literally scream about falsification. Engineers and mechanics will understand me immediately. We're talking about standards and unification. Have you ever tried to screw a Soviet screw into a modern imported nut? Most likely it won't work due to the difference in thread pitch. Now let's transport ourselves to the 19th century. We are told that the Eiffel Tower and the Crystal Palace were assembled from millions of parts produced by different contractors. At that time, a unified system of standards was only just emerging. Whitworth's standard for screw threads was adopted in Britain only in 1841, and its implementation took decades. In France and other countries, there was complete disarray. Every factory, every workshop had its own patterns, its own inches and its own feet. And in this chaos, are we supposed to believe that thousands of tons of metal structures manufactured in different workshops were brought to the construction site and they fit together perfectly? The holes aligned, the bolts went in smoothly, the beams joined without gaps. This is technical absurdity. You don't need to mine ore, you don't need to burn forests. You simply take what's ready, adapt it slightly to your needs, and present it as your own invention. This explains why the quality of metal in old structures often surpasses modern equivalents. This explains the absence of slag heaps, which should have been mountain-sized if production had started from scratch. We live on the ruins of giants, using their spoons and forks, and proudly call it industrialization. The technological leap of the 19th century was too sharp, too unnatural. In 50 years, humanity supposedly jumped from oil lamps to electricity and skyscrapers. In biology and sociology, such leaps are impossible without external intervention or the use of an already existing base. We look at the intricate lattices of old bridges, at complex riveted structures, and fail to grasp the main point. This is not just iron. These are elements of a single global system whose purpose we have forgotten. The Crystal Palace and the Eiffel Tower are not exhibition pavilions. Their form, their structure, their materials hint at a purely technical, functional purpose. Perhaps these were stations for transmitting energy, atmospheric electricity, about which researchers of Tartaria speak so much, and the metal for them was not cast by gardeners and bridge builders. It was taken from reserves that miraculously survived the catastrophe. Now let's come down to earth and look at details that literally scream about falsification. Engineers and mechanics will understand me immediately. We're talking about standards and unification. Have you ever tried to screw a Soviet screw into a modern imported nut? Most likely it won't work due to the difference in thread pitch. Now let's transport ourselves to the 19th century. We are told that the Eiffel Tower and the Crystal Palace were assembled from millions of parts produced by different contractors. At that time, a unified system of standards was only just emerging. Whitworth's standard for screw threads was adopted in Britain only in 1841, and its implementation took decades. In France and other countries, there was complete disarray. Every factory, every workshop had its own patterns, its own inches, and its own feet. And in this chaos, are we supposed to believe that thousands of tons of metal structures manufactured in different workshops, were brought to the construction site, and they fit together perfectly. The holes aligned, the bolts went in smoothly, the beams joined without gaps. This is technical absurdity. Even today, with computers and laser control, major construction projects constantly face problems with misaligned elements. And back then, with manual production and the absence of unified metrological standards, the assembly of the Eiffel Tower should have turned into an endless nightmare of files and sledgehammers. But in photos, we see perfectly straight lines. This indicates one thing: the parts were manufactured at a single, high-tech production complex that operated according to unified, strict standards. A complex that simply does not exist in the official history of the 19th century. Where did the casting molds disappear to? This is another question that puzzles historians. To cast a complex cast iron part, a mold is needed. For the unique decorative elements and nodes of the Crystal Palace, thousands of complex molds would have been required. This is a huge volume of pattern equipment. Where are they? In museums, we are shown a couple of wooden boxes, but for production on such a scale, hangars filled with molds would have been needed. They are absent, as if the parts were not cast but materialized from thin air, or more likely, taken ready-made from the warehouses of that very erased civilization. Pay attention to the so-called World's Fairs: London, Paris, Chicago, Philadelphia. The scenario is always the same. Gigantic complexes of stone and metal, striking in their grandeur and ancient architecture, are built in incredibly short periods. We are told that these are temporary pavilions made of plaster and sticks. But look at the photographs of the ruins after fires or demolition. Powerful rebar sticks out there. Capital brick walls and steel frames are visible. Why build capital buildings for one season, only to demolish them later? This is economic suicide. There is a frightening suspicion that the World's Fairs were not a demonstration of achievements, but a cover-up operation. Authorities discovered surviving ancient city factories, fenced them off, put up an exhibition sign, and then methodically destroyed or rebuilt them, presenting them as their own creations. The Chicago World's Fair of 1893 is a prime example. A white city shining with electricity, with moving walkways and incredible architecture. We are told that all of this was built in a couple of years from lath and plaster. Do you believe this? Looking at colonnades and domes that rival the Roman Pantheon? And then, after the exhibition closes, strange fires destroy these temporary structures. Very convenient. No building, no possibility to conduct material expertise. Fire erases everything. We see here the signature of a global purge. Not just buildings were destroyed, evidence was destroyed. Evidence that we are not the first developed civilization on this earth, but perhaps degraded descendants or settlers who came to everything ready-made. Another fact that makes one uneasy: the depth of the foundations. When modern builders try to reconstruct buildings of that era or construct new ones nearby, they often come across floors extending deep underground. The Polytechnic Museum in Moscow, buildings in Paris and London, they all have full-fledged floors underground with windows and doors. Historians mumble about a cultural layer. What cultural layer could bury the first floors of buildings 3 to 4 meters deep in 100 years? This is not dust from passers-by's shoes. These are traces of a catastrophic flood, a mudslide, which covered cities with clay and dirt. And it was from this dirt that the tops of those very metal frameworks protruded, which we know as railway stations and exhibition pavilions. Our ancestors, those very people in top hats and with walking sticks, simply dug them up, cleaned them, inserted new glass, and called it a triumph of 19th century engineering. They appropriated someone else's legacy because they themselves could not produce even 1/100th of that metal and stone. We live in scenery not built by us, and use technologies whose operating principles we do not fully understand, reducing everything to the primitive burning of coal and oil. We are approaching the most frightening part of our investigation, which sends shivers down one's spine. If we acknowledge that it was technically and logistically impossible to build these gigantic metal structures in the 19th century, then the question inevitably arises: what was their true purpose? Official history feeds us fairy tales that the Eiffel Tower is just an entrance arch for an exhibition, and the Crystal Palace is a large greenhouse. But let's look at these objects through the eyes of a power engineer, not a tourist. Before us are gigantic conductive circuits. The metal used in these structures possesses strange properties that we are only just beginning to rediscover. There is a well-founded theory that all this architecture of iron and copper was part of a global network for extracting atmospheric electricity, or, as it was called before, ether. Look at the spire of the Eiffel Tower. It is a classic discharge device. The entire structure functions as a gigantic antenna, extending deep into the earth, where, as we discovered, the real foundations and technical flaws are hidden. The authorities of that time, those very usurpers who seized the world after the catastrophe, perfectly understood what lay before them. But they did not need free electricity, accessible to everyone anywhere on the planet. They needed power and control. Free energy makes a person free. But energy that must be sold, coal, oil, gas, makes a person a slave. This is precisely why we see a strange paradox at the end of the 19th century. Against the backdrop of standing, and possibly still functioning, ether towers, primitive internal combustion engines and dirty coal generation began to be imposed upon us. This was the greatest sabotage in human history. To force us to pay for light and heat, the old infrastructure of free energy had to be destroyed. This is why the Crystal Palace burned. This is why magnificent exhibition pavilions in America were demolished. This was not the demolition of dilapidated housing. It was the clearing of evidence. They destroyed technologies that could have turned our lives into paradise and drove us into a man-made dead end based on burning resources. Nikola Tesla invented nothing new. He simply found access to the preserved knowledge of that era, tried to revive it, and was immediately destroyed by financial elites like Morgan, who did not want free energy for the people. But there is an even darker secret connected with this period. Where did they get the people to service this new slave economy? We have already spoken about the emptiness of cities in old photos, but then a demographic explosion occurs that defies any logical explanation. The Earth's population begins to grow exponentially, despite unsanitary conditions, diseases, and wars. Where did these millions of new citizens come from? Recall the phenomenon of incubators. At the end of the 19th century, at all major exhibitions, alongside technological marvels, babies were displayed in incubators. We are told that this was the salvation of premature infants, but the scale of this phenomenon is frightening. These were entire pavilions filled with infants without parents. There is a gruesome version that after a global cataclysm, which destroyed most of the adult population, the new masters of the world launched a program of artificial population restoration. These orphan trains, which traveled across the USA distributing hundreds of thousands of children of unknown origin to farms, are links in the same chain. We were raised anew. We were settled in the empty cities left by the previous civilization. We were given shovels and picks and sent to mine coal so we wouldn't ask too many questions. We are a cargo cult civilization. We live in houses we don't know how to build. We walk on bridges whose operating principles we have forgotten. We worship iron frameworks, considering them cultural monuments, although in reality they are disconnected generators of life. Think about the dates. 1812, 1850. The fires of Moscow, Washington, the great fires in US cities. These are not coincidences. These are stages of war and cleansing. The old world with its harmony of metal and stone, with its etheric energy, was destroyed. On its ruins, our world was built, a world of soot, oil, and lies. The Eiffel Tower stands as a tombstone over the grave of a great civilization, and we, like tourists, take selfies against the backdrop of our own lost memory, not even suspecting that this pile of metal could illuminate all of Paris for free, if only we knew how to flip the switch.